Good morning. The House Armed Services Committee meets today to receive testimony on the way forward in Afghanistan, particularly in light of the President's recent decision to withdraw 10,000 U.S. troops from Afghanistan by the end of the year and the remaining 23,000 surge forces by next summer. As I noted during our hearing with the Department last month, I'm deeply concerned about the aggressive troop withdrawals proposed by President Obama. Every witness before this committee this year has testified that the comprehensive counterinsurgency strategy the President committed to in December of 2009 is bearing fruit. In recent congressional testimony, both Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Michael Mullen, and now former International Security Assistance Force Commander, General David Petraeus, stated that the President's formulation went beyond the options they had recommended. Both Mullen and Petraeus noted that the approaches they had recommended would have assumed less risk. I'm particularly concerned about the specific timing of the redeployment of the surge forces. General Petraeus reportedly recommended that the bulk of the surge forces be redeployed by the end of 2012, thereby making them available through the end of 2012 fighting season. Instead, many of the redeploying units will be tied up, making their logistical preparations for redeployment during the height of the fighting season. This suggests that the redeployment deadline did not reflect a carefully conceived operational plan, but rather was designed to conform to the political calendar. Although troop strength is not the only variable in determining strategic success or failure in Afghanistan, it affects all other variables by shaping the perceptions of America's commitment to that country and its people. Fears of wavering resolve will further incentivize Afghan corruption, as the possibility of renewed civil war may cause Afghans to seek short-term profits. Such doubts would also undermine efforts to end the war through some sort of reconciliation process. U.S. commanders reportedly have until October 15th of this year to submit a plan regarding the details of the remaining 2012 redeployments. However, on a July 6th press conference, then ISF Joint Commander, Lieutenant General David Rodriguez, identified units that were coming out of Afghanistan starting this month. It's not entirely clear whether these units were never intended to be replaced and therefore not part of the President's plan, or if the redeployment is occurring in advance of October 15th. Thus, this hearing comes at a particularly opportune time to consider the strategic alternatives for the war effort in Afghanistan. Can we maintain the current balance between counterinsurgency and counterterrorism operations in light of troop reductions? Will we be able to shift the focus of operations from RC South and Southwest to RC East as originally planned? What are the implications for our reduced footprint on our training, advise, and assist missions? These are merely a few of the strategic considerations this committee must consider in exercising its oversight role in this critical conflict. Fortunately, today we have three uniquely expert witnesses to discuss our way ahead in Afghanistan, and we're happy to have them here. Ranking Member Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this hearing and bringing in such well-qualified witnesses. This is a subject that this committee and I think the broader Congress needs to be more focused on. Certainly with the debt crisis swirling around us, it has sucked all of the oxygen and all of the focus to some degree as well. It should. But we still have 100,000 U.S. troops in Afghanistan, and this is still the central piece of our national security strategy and something that we all need to become more informed on. So I look forward to the testimony from our three very well-qualified witnesses and to the discussion that follows. I think we also need to recognize, as the Chairman did, the tremendous success that our troops have brought us in the last 18 months. The surge has been successful. For all of the problems and challenges in that region in Pakistan and Afghanistan, I think much of the reporting often misses this point. For those of us who have been there over the years, you can see the progress, and I see that reflected in much of the testimony today that has been made, particularly in the South. We have pushed back the Taliban, held ground, and I think as importantly done more than just focus on the military side of this. We have begun to focus on the governance side of this as well. When I was in Afghanistan last time, I had never seen so many folks from the State Department, from USID, from the Agriculture Department, Justice Department recognizing the need to get the governance right. So we have made progress, and our troops are to be commended. They did so with great courage and at great sacrifice. Now, I think the great challenge going forward is how we begin to make the handoff to the Afghan government. We have to do that. We cannot stay forever for a variety of different reasons, and in this part of the world, that's not an easy thing to do. Afghanistan does not have a history of stable governance. They do not have a history of a stable economy. No matter when and how we do this, it is going to be fraught with risk and it is going to be difficult. But we must begin that process. And I think that's the thing I look forward to hearing most from our witnesses. What's the best and smartest way to do that? And it is a matter of managing risk. It's not a matter of saying if we just stay an extra year, then we can be absolutely sure that the successes that we've had will hold. There's no perfect time to do this, so we need to figure out how to do it best as we're moving forward. This is an extraordinarily difficult part of the world. As I've said many times, I wish we did not have national security interests in Afghanistan and Pakistan. It is a very complex and difficult place with severe governance problems both in Pakistan and Afghanistan. But the truth is we do have very strong national security interests in Afghanistan and Pakistan, and they are relatively simple. We want stable governments in both countries that can stand, so the violent extremists like Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, both in Afghanistan and Pakistan, aren't able to take over those governments or even hold substantial areas of space so that they can plot and plan attacks against us. That is our interest, but it is very difficult to achieve. And I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today as to how we should best proceed going forward with our plans to achieve those interests. And with that, I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. We have with us three retired military people who have dedicated their lives to service to our country. We're happy to have you here. General John Keane is former Vice Chief of Staff of the Army, one of the authors of the successful 2007 Iraq surge, and has recently returned from an assessment trip to Afghanistan. Lieutenant General David Barno commanded Combined Forces Command Afghanistan from 2003 to 2005, and is co-author of the study Responsible Transition, Securing U.S. Interests in Afghanistan Beyond 2011. And former Assistant Secretary of Defense and Marine Colonel Bing West is the author of the counterinsurgency classic The Village, and more recently, The Wrong War, drawn from his experiences embedded with units in Afghanistan. Gentlemen, thank you for your service. Thank you for being here with us today. We'll hear first from General Keane.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, ranking minority and members of the committee, for allowing me once again to testify on the war in Afghanistan. I truly appreciate my distinguished colleagues who joined me here today and the contribution that they have made and will continue to make. I just completed this month an assessment for General Petraeus in Afghanistan and briefed General John Allen, General Petraeus' successor, who is now the commander of International Security Assistance Forces, Afghanistan. This is the third assessment in less than a year. Let me briefly provide some highlights from that assessment, which we can explore further in question and answers if you desire. The President's recent drawdown decision of 33,000 troops no later than September 2012 has increased the risk significantly and threatens the overall mission success. The ISAF Command is conducting detailed assessments of the drawdown impacts and what can be done to mitigate the risk. The Taliban have suffered a stunning defeat in the south, in Kandahar and Helmand province, so much so that it's not reversible unless we draw down ISAF troops in those provinces prematurely. I am making the statement it's not reversible after considerable analysis, and there are three major reasons. First, we own the ground and are staying on it with Afghan National Security Forces and not departing as we have done so many times in the past. The Taliban have tried to come back and have failed time and time again during this spring and summer offensive. They are reduced to softer targets, assassinations, and attacks on the Afghan people. Number two, we have destroyed the Taliban's logistical infrastructure, their IED factories and caches, numbers well over 1,000, which prevents the Taliban from sustaining their operations. And number three, the people are aligned with ISAF and the Afghan National Security Forces, and as such, are providing assistance with tips, early warning, and cache locations. In fact, a highly respected intelligence chief with considerable experience believes the Taliban and the people in Kandahar province, after many years, are, quote, getting a divorce, unquote. In the South, therefore, we have a much improved security situation, which in time the Afghan National Security Forces will be able to take over and, in fact, lead. The security situation in the South improved dramatically because of the President of the United States' decision to escalate the war and provide much-needed additional resources. Most of the so-called surge forces were applied in the South, the birthplace and center of gravity of the Taliban. Secondly, the Afghan National Security Forces have improved in quality and quantity and now number about 300,000 with a final force level of 352,000. This proves once again that quantity does have a quality all of its own. Moreover, the Afghan local police, or ALP, essentially part-time village police selected by village elders, trained by the special forces to protect the villages in the contested areas after the Taliban have been driven out, is a potential game changer and one of the most successful programs that we have enacted. And finally, there is a noticeable improvement in governance in the South, and the degree that this exists, frankly, did surprise me, with better leadership in district and sub-district governors and the numerous elected councils at the village and district levels. Government capacity has improved, but there is a long way to go before the national government is providing effective services at the local level. Our next major contested area, which the Chairman mentioned, is the East, from Kabul to the Pakistan border. We have been conducting a defense in depth from that Pakistan border to Kabul, which by and large has been successful in that Kabul is relatively stable and the legitimacy of the national government is not threatened by the insurgency. All that said, to defeat the Taliban and the Haqqani network in the East, it must become our main effort, and it will require an aggressive, comprehensive campaign. Those plans are in the making as we speak. Remember, the campaign in the South and the one in the East, which we're talking about, are not being conducted simultaneously, but sequentially, because the President of the United States' 2009 decision did not provide the 40,000 requested forces by Generals McChrystal and Petraeus. The command received 30,000. Thus, a sequential operation and not simultaneously conducted. Indeed, the campaign in the East is further threatened by the imminent withdrawal of 1/3 of our U.S. forces by September 2012. We cannot discuss the security situation in Afghanistan without mentions of the sanctuaries in Pakistan, which are the engine of the insurgency. They are Sharman and Quetta in the south and Miriam Shah in the east. Almost all of the middle and senior level leaders of the insurgency come from these sanctuaries, many of the fighters, and 80% of all the material for IEDs originate in Pakistan factories. To succeed in Afghanistan, something must be done about the sanctuaries. A few points of emphasis. We lack a regional strategy for South Asia, which Afghanistan and Pakistan are an important part. We must recognize our soft policy with Pakistan as it pertains to the sanctuaries has failed. There is no doubt that General Kiani and General Pasha, the Chief of Staff and the Director of ISI, are complicit in supporting the sanctuaries. We need a new approach diplomatically that recognizes their manipulation of the United States government and, frankly, how destructive the military oligarchy is to the future growth and development of Pakistan. We all know that the Pakistanis are paranoid about their political and competitive struggle with India. But we should recognize that the Pakistanis have clearly lost. India is a democracy which is one of the fastest growing economies in the world, and Pakistan is moving in the opposite direction. And moreover, in reference to the sanctuaries, We must consider covert and military operations against the sanctuaries. It should be on the table. And let me conclude by saying significant progress has been made in Afghanistan, but success is certainly not guaranteed. The consequences of failure and the direct impact to the security of the United States are unacceptable. Many challenges remain. We lack a coherent political and economic strategy for Afghanistan. Ryan Crocker, who took his post this week as the United States ambassador, will do much to turn around that reality. He is the best in the United States government and will truly make a difference. We need a red line for President Karzai not staying in power. It is unacceptable that he would manipulate the political forces to do that very thing. The Strategic Partnership Agreement, or SPA, impacts our success. It anchors our commitment and communicates the same to all of the players in and outside of Afghanistan. The sooner we achieve this agreement, which is being negotiated now, the better. At a minimum, the 33,000 drawdown no later than September 2012 should be moved to no later than December 2012 to permit all those forces to be used during the entire fighting season of 2012. While Afghanistan is hard and it's complicated to be sure, we can accomplish the mission of transition to the Afghan National Security Forces. Protracted wars test the mettle of our great democracy. This war is worth fighting and is most certainly worth winning. Our courage, moral and financial support, and political determination to see it through is essential to success. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, General. General Barno.
Chairman McKeon, Ranking Member Mr. Smith, and members of the committee, thanks for providing me the opportunity to share my views with you today on the way ahead in Afghanistan. In addition to my 19 months serving in Afghanistan as the overall U.S. and coalition commander, I stayed actively engaged in analyzing our efforts across the region. I've traveled back to both Afghanistan and Pakistan several times in recent years, with my most recent trip being a week-long visit to Pakistan in January of this year, from which I drew some very interesting conclusions about Pakistan's role and as we look at the road ahead here. I also have two sons that are active duty Army officers who've spent many of the last several years shuttling in and out of Afghanistan, and I stay up to date on what the war looks like through young officers, young captains' eyes through their experiences. It also gives me an appreciation of the sacrifices our families are making connected to the military all across this country as they face deployments that continue for their loved ones into this part of the world. The last time I testified in front of the committee was March of 2009, and at that time I gave an assessment of the situation in Afghanistan, and I presented a framework for what I believe would achieve success there. And I characterized it as a math equation, that success equals leadership plus strategy plus resources. Leadership plus strategy plus resources. In 2009, I outlined in some detail why I thought all three of those categories were falling short in Afghanistan. Leadership, strategy, and our resources. The good news today is that in each of these three variables, the United States has dramatically improved its position since 2009, much of which General Keane has so carefully articulated. I would tell you that General Stan McChrystal, Dave Petraeus, and now John Allen have brought huge talent and counterinsurgency experience to bear in Afghanistan, and it's had an immensely positive effect on the war. Resources have been increased dramatically, both in dollars and troops, and they've enabled a new strategy to make our new military and civilian leadership over the last 2 years to enable them to make substantial, although I think fragile still, gains. That progress was wholly missing, entirely absent in 2009. Sustaining the success of the last 18 months will perhaps now be even more difficult than the campaign over the last 2 years that have wrenched the momentum away from the Taliban and put them on their back foot. I would suggest that as General Allen and Ambassador Crocker now take the reins of the effort, they face 5 major challenges. First, I think we've got to find a way to dispel the uncertainty about U.S. intentions over the long term with regard to Afghanistan and the region. Failing to clearly make commitments that outline a long-term U.S. presence in the region encourages all the actors in the region to hedge their bets, to base all of their calculations on the question, what would this decision look like the day after the Americans are gone? Such uncertainty about U.S. intentions deeply undercuts our leverage and our long-term goals in the region. And the hard reality is that we cannot protect our vital interests in the region, keeping relentless pressure on Al-Qaeda without at least a limited U.S. military presence. The second challenge is that we must rebuild our relationship with Pakistan. During the week I visited there in January, we had an American kill 2 Pakistanis. A third died as a result of that incident that began a downward spiral of our relations that was only accelerated by the death of Osama bin Laden with the U.S. Special Operations strike. While rebuilding these relations is outside of General Allen and Ambassador Crocker's responsibility directly in Kabul, our strategic goals in the region center much more on Pakistan than they do on Afghanistan in the long haul. Pakistan is the second largest Islamic country in the world. It has somewhere in the neighborhood of 100 nuclear weapons. Its population today is 187 million, compared to 30 million next door in Afghanistan, the second poorest country in the world. By 2050, Pakistan will have 300 million Pakistanis, almost as large as the United States is today. Our new Afghan leadership team, therefore, has got to work closely with our leadership team in Islamabad, our ambassador there, Cameron Munter, and our U.S. senior military leader, Lieutenant General John Keane, to think through a regional approach to U.S. policy in this part of the world. Now, one could argue they ought to be implementing a regional U.S. policy, but in reality, as General Keane pointed out, we really don't have a discernible regional security strategy for South and Central Asia, which I think is essential. The third challenge we've got in the coming months is to rebuild relations with President Hamid Karzai, at the same time opening the doors for his transition in 2014. The U.S. is beginning to think about this now, and in midterm planning needs to start look at setting conditions for a constitutional transition of power by President Karzai to some unknown successor. Part of what Ambassador Crocker is going to need to do is help build that bench of possible candidates out there, or at least encourage the establishment of that in the coming years to ensure a peaceful transition of power to sustain all the political efforts in Afghanistan over the last 10 years. This is a critical part of a political strategy that the U.S. has a fairly limited outline of today. Fourth, our new team in Kabul has got to focus on continuing the effort to defeat the enemy's strategy, both Al-Qaeda's strategy and the Taliban strategy. I think Al-Qaeda has taken very serious blows over the last 18 months, but I also would argue that their looming demise, that their destruction is not something that's imminent, that we still face a very deadly enemy out there who's not only in this part of the world, but has reached his tentacles to the Arabian Peninsula and to North Africa. We have to continue to keep relentless pressure on his headquarters, as it were, in South and Central Asia. In the case of the Taliban, we have to defeat a strategy that's, simply put, is run out the clock. Run out the clock on the Americans, wait the international effort's departure, and then continue the fight. As we continue to signal about our long-term intentions and don't articulate what our plans are beyond 2014, we continue to add a brighter light at the end of the Taliban's tunnel. And finally, our new team in Kabul has got to manage a transition to a future over the next few years with fewer U.S. resources, both in troops and in dollars, matched against our war aims, which really have not changed to achieve our objectives there. As we know, U.S. troops are going to decline 33,000 in the next 18 months or so, and at the same time those troops go down, the dollars associated with spending for them in country are going to decline as well. We have to be very cautious that this decline in U.S. spending in Afghanistan doesn't completely destroy the Afghan economy and undercut all of our other efforts. So in closing, I would just say that the most important point I think we have to consider today is that the U.S. has vital national security interests in this part of the world that transcend our efforts in Afghanistan. As we negotiate this upcoming transition as we navigate these challenging waters in the next 3.5 years towards 2014, we have to make sure this transition ultimately protects those vital interests and doesn't put them at grave risk. Thank you.
Thank you, General. Secretary West.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, thank you very much for having me as the token Marine today. I will attempt to keep my remarks very brief. I'd like to start by saying that I agree entirely with General Keane that this decision of when to withdraw the troops was manifestly not an operational plan, and it's regrettable, but there we are. I do believe that our objective has been achieved in Afghanistan and will continue to be achieved, provided the Afghan Army holds together. Our objective, in my judgment, is not nation building. We've gotten beyond that. Our objective is to prevent a terrorist sanctuary. And if you define a terrorist sanctuary as being that you have to be able to live in comfort the way Osama bin Laden did in Pakistan, and that you need electricity and you need access to some lines of communication and highways, if you define it that way, then there's no way in Afghanistan today that any terrorist can diddy-bop into some house and think he's going to be safe, turn anything on electric and think that he's still going to be alive within 24 to 48 hours. Our Special Operations Forces, the network of spies, and our extraordinary airborne surveillance and electronics mean, as I believe General Barno was just indicating, that we could sustain this. There will be no sanctuary there indefinitely with a small force, provided we had some sort of long-term agreement with the Afghan government. The Taliban can be pains in the neck in the rural areas for the next 100 years, but they lack mass and they lack anything beyond basic weapons. The only way the Taliban can win, defined as taking the cities and becoming a government that supports terrorists, is that the Afghan army collapses. It's the only way they can do it, whether we're there or not. 2014, therefore, I think becomes the critical aspect when you're looking forward. I believe Afghanistan is going to be a mess in 2014 because the coalition economic aid and military aid is going to go off the side of a cliff. I don't particularly care if it's a mess, economically and politically, provided the Afghan army still remains together as an institution. And so I see both the largest risk, Mr. Chairman, and our core interest, more than anything else, is simply sustaining resources for the Afghan army. And the biggest risk I see is the parallel to Vietnam. General Allen is well aware that he's in the position of General Abrams in about 1970. And General Abrams, no matter the good job he did, as we began to withdraw our troops, we slashed the aid to the South Vietnamese army, and eventually they fell apart. So I would recommend, Mr. Chairman, that serious consideration be given. We're broke as a country, and therefore serious consideration be given not to adding money in those out years, but to arranging some sort of trade-off in terms of our near-term economic and military resources, in turn for a lockbox. And I know you hear that and you say, oh, you can never do it, but a lockbox for General Allen and for the commander after him, so that he can tell the Afghan army, we have money set aside for you, and I control that money with the Congress over the next several years, because that's the single greatest signal we can give to the Afghan army is, don't worry about it, we're still going to pay for you after 2014, because he who has the gold rules. Thank you.
Thank you very much. During his testimony before this committee in March, General Petraeus noted that the United States had previously attempted both counterterrorism and counterinsurgency light strategies, and that both had proven inadequate. Gentlemen, will we be able to continue a comprehensive counterinsurgency strategy with 1/3 of our troops departing, leaving Afghanistan before the end of the next fighting season? And how does the President's order affect the risk to our forces and to our strategic objectives?
Okay, I'll start with that answer. Well, given the success that we've already achieved in the South, which, as I indicated, is quite dramatic, what the mission there is to not to sacrifice that success by prematurely moving forces from there to the east. And that's what the command is assessing right now. I would imagine that they'll accept some risk probably in Helmand province and probably keep the forces where they are in Kandahar province. And then the issue becomes the counterinsurgency strategy, which is necessary in the east to bring about the defeat of the Taliban and the Haqqani network as it operates in Afghanistan. We cannot do that alone with so-called counter-terrorist activities, which, after all, was what we have been doing for many years while Afghanistan was on a diet in terms of resources, and that's what we were doing for 3 years in Iraq. And both of those efforts did not succeed against the re-emerging Taliban in Afghanistan and a very significant presence by the Haqqani network. So yes, the counterinsurgency strategy must continue to be applied. And I think what the command will do, those certainly taking down 1/3 of the forces by September of 2012, make no mistake about it, will have significant impact. What they will try to do is mitigate those force reductions by using a number of enablers in the east, not just additional combat forces, but additional intelligence assets, acceleration of the Afghan national security forces for the east, dramatically increasing this program that I mentioned that's not particularly well understood, but it is having quite an effect in Afghanistan, and that's the ALP, Afghan Local Police Program. So they're looking at all of those things to mitigate that risk so that we can go into the east with a comprehensive, aggressive campaign and achieve the kind of results that we have achieved in the South. I believe the only way we can succeed is to put in play a counterinsurgency strategy in the east. It remains to be seen whether we'll be as successful there as we were in the South. I'm cautiously optimistic about it. Why? Because of the sheer talent of the people that we have, the leaders. Our force is very experienced force, and they do know what they're doing. And also this growth and development of the Afghan national security forces. It's unfortunate they have to accept the degree of risk I'm talking about. And let me say about what's risk and what frustrates me so much about this decision. When you ask our forces, U.S. forces, to do more with less, what that means are more casualties. And that's the elephant in the room that we don't talk about. But that's the truth of it, what's going to happen here. And they'll step up to that and with all the courage and determination that they display every single day. They know what's going on here. So, yes, counterinsurgency strategy must be applied in the East. The Afghan National Security Forces will be a part of it. The command will find ways to mitigate the reduction of those forces, and it remains to be seen if we can be as successful as we have been in the South when we apply that strategy in the East.
Thank you. General Barno?
Just to add briefly to that, I think the key to answering that question is whether the Afghan National Army can step up to the plate and actually enter the counterinsurgency fight in ways with U.S. advisors, with U.S. enablers that can allow Afghan units to substitute for American units. Right now there's 164,000 soldiers in the Afghan National Army. That's larger than the entire U.S. NATO force combined. The question is, can those units, are they now at the level of training, of leadership? Are they set up with U.S. advisors and adequate trainers to be able to substitute for some of these American units that are coming out? That day has got to come. We're between now and the end of 2014, the major change we're going to make in our approach in Afghanistan is not in the counterterrorism arena. That's going to look very much the same in 2011, 2012, 2013, 2014. What's going to change is how we prosecute the remainder of the campaign, the counterinsurgency campaign. And the big change there will be Afghan units stepping into the slots that American units are vacating as they come back home. So the critical element of success here is the capacity and the effectiveness of these Afghan units. If we can answer that question yes, then we can achieve what's been laid out over the next 2 and 3 years. But if they're not, much as Mr. West has pointed out, then we're going to have a very serious problem.
Secretary?
I think, sir, we get very confused when we use terms like counterterrorism and counterinsurgency. I don't really know what they mean. And I will say that I've spent a lot of time up in the east, Nuristan and Konar, etc. We're not going to take those mountains. We don't have the helicopters to do it. We're wearing a lot of heavy gear. The other side isn't. That fight in those mountains is going to go on for decades. But we shouldn't particularly care up in those mountains. They're just little piss ants up there. I mean, they can give you problems, but they're not getting to Kabul. If they're not really getting down into the plains and coming after you, they can remain rabble up there fighting from tribe to tribe for a long, long time. What bothers me most about our counterinsurgency is that we have shoveled money at a problem in an astonishing way for no gain. The billions of dollars that we've been spending and spending and spending and saying that every soldier is a nation builder, what we've done is we've caused a culture of entitlement to spread among all Afghans over the last 10 years. And just as President Johnson found out it was wrong to have the Great Society when the same thing I believe has happened in Afghanistan. You don't get something back when you give something and expect nothing, because then you get nothing back. I don't think we're really going to see what's really going to happen in the East or in the South until we stop doing it for them. And I don't know whether that puts me in the counterinsurgent or counterterrorist camp, but either way, sir, I think that as long as the Afghan army is willing to get after it, it's going to be okay. If the Afghan army isn't willing to get after it, it's not going to be okay. But on balance, I think the Afghan army is beginning to think we can handle these Taliban, and we can handle Haqqani. And I think that should be the main effort, not the Americans doing it for them.
Thank you very much. Ranking Member Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If I could follow up on that, actually, General West. I mean, that's kind of the issue. We need to hand off responsibility to the Afghans. And so, two-part question. The first thing, I want to get a little better idea from all of you, I guess, about the capability of the Afghan Army and the Afghan police. We've spent a fair amount of money training them, and this question is not a mere matter of numbers, it's a matter of capability. But I know one of the big focuses in the surge in the last 2 years was to focus on that capability, was to focus on not just cranking them out, but to actually give them the type of training to develop leadership skills, to develop, special forces capabilities. I know that we've had our special forces folks over there training Afghan special forces for a while. Those numbers have expanded. Logically, it would seem that at least in the last 2 years, there should have been some sort of increase, not just in numbers, but in capability of the Afghan, just focusing on the military and the police for the moment, on the security forces. I wonder if any of you could gauge a little bit how much that capability has increased.
I'll be glad to start it. Well, I think that there has been significant growth and development here. And I've spent a lot of time on this because, for all the obvious reasons, everybody sitting here knows that the Afghan National Security Forces eventually will determine whether we're successful in Afghanistan or not. So that is crucial to our future. So thus, your question is right on a target. The fact of the matter is the growth of the Army has been more than acceptable. And I just don't use my own judgment about it. I'm using the judgment of company commanders, battalion commanders. And what we are doing is we're operating side by side with them. And we did this in Iraq. And when we started to do that in Iraq in 2007, the growth of the force was exponential. While we have advisors with them, to be sure, when they operate with another infantry platoon, side by side, they see what the sergeant does, they see what the soldier does, they see how they do it, they see how they interact with their officers, they see their discipline, their determination, they see their integrity, all of that on display. it has quite an impact on them. So they have grown as a result of that, and that's going to continue. The police are still uneven and behind the growth and development of the Army, and I think most everyone knows that's true in this room. I'm encouraged by the Army and its performance. I mean, there is a question mark out there, and we haven't answered it yet. As we transition to where they are in the lead, totally in charge, we've done that in 6 districts right now, and we're in the very beginning stages of that. Based on that transition that is unfolding right in front of us, those transition decisions have been sound. There's no pushback in terms of the Afghans being in the lead. But none of those areas were real tough areas. That is coming in 2012, when we start to turn over what has been tough areas.
If I could, I want to focus in the question a little bit, and I don't want to take everybody else's time here. I guess the big question is, you said eventually we have to make that turnover. And then, as Mr. West pointed out, part of it is, they've been getting something for nothing for a while, and we all like something for nothing, so you want to keep getting it. Isn't there a point at which that transition has to start? And if we were to say, as you suggested, and I'm not quite sure whether, I don't think General West was suggesting this as well, that we shouldn't plan on drawing down 30,000 forces over the course of the next 18 months. We should keep it up. But if we had sent that message to the Afghan Army, if we'd said, relax, we're going to stick around for another year and a half, we're going to keep the same numbers, doesn't that have the opposite effect? I mean, that sort of create the problem. Don't we have to do, in essence, what the President has said we have to do? I mean, we'd all like to keep doing it with the most capable force in the world, which is ours, no question. But you can't make the transition if you don't make the transition, if you don't at some point begin to move the numbers back down. And we're talking about reducing by 30,000 over the course of 18 months, leaving a force of 70,000 plus 40,000 NATO and all that. I mean, isn't that sort of a reasonable transition towards accomplishing what I think all of you acknowledge is the most important thing, and that's getting the Afghan Army to take responsibility for the fight?
Before the President's decision, General Petraeus' campaign plan transitions the entire effort by 2014. Because that was the Lisbon Agreement that NATO made, and the United States was part and parcel to that agreement. So there was.
But we're not going to go 100,000 to zero on December 15th.
Indisputable that we were going to transition by 2014, and which provinces and which districts, they have a detailed campaign plan for that based on what the conditions on the ground are. The only dispute over the 33,000 is the timing of it.
Sure,
that's the issue, and I don't want to overly dwell on it. That is the issue, the timing of it.
It's a rather critical point, because it's the cornerstone of the message, and if the message is that decision has significantly undermined our ability to succeed, that's a pretty important point to be making. And so I think it's worth dwelling on. If we're talking about, total transition, by January 2014, and then by, mid to late 2012, we're dropping 30,000. I mean, I'm no expert in terms of how, you slide down a graph here, particularly when you're talking about, military matters, but it strikes me as reasonable from a basic numbers standpoint in terms of getting towards that 2014 goal.
But it just ignores the operational requirements on the ground in terms of what we're trying to achieve. We've got 2 major operational efforts going sequentially versus simultaneously, which any commander would rather do. And the priority is in the East. I think what you'll see the command do, they'll try to keep these forces as long as they can keep them, as opposed to a gradual drawdown in 2012. It'll probably look more like a waterfall come September, so they can keep those forces in the fight and then have them out on the President's timeline to be sure.
Could I just quickly get the other 2 in here, because I'm abusing my privileges here as ranking member, but I want to get just a couple quick comments from the other 2 generals about what they think about that analysis.
I don't think that the timeline for next summer is optimal. I think I've said in other commentary that that reduces the commander's flexibility on the ground. On the other side of the coin, I don't think it's a game stopper from the standpoint of what commanders have to do. I think it makes it more difficult. It increases the risks. The more important conclusion, though, I think that needs to happen, or we need to think about a bit, is are we resourcing the effort to get the Afghan National Army into the fight well enough? Numbers I've seen this week point out that the number of trainers that they need in the Afghan National Army is about 2,800. That's been resourced at about 1,600 for the last several years, about 58%. So we have not, despite the number of forces we've had in Afghanistan, for whatever reasons, partly because of NATO's commitments, we have not fully resourced training the Afghan Army. That needs to change because of the importance of their upcoming responsibility.
Thank you. Mr. Wax.
As anytime you put an American battalion in the field, that battalion is going to fight. As long as the Afghans see us doing the fighting, they're going to let us do the fighting for them. Yes, I've been out there with them in March down in Sangin province, which is a tough place, Sangin district. I was out with an American platoon, a Marine platoon that had side by side the Afghans. But every single firefight, of course the Marines took the lead. So even though you were side by side, the American, being the better fighter, just fell into the lead. We're not going to know, sir, how good they are until they're out there by themselves. And I think they're going to cut a lot of deals. But on balance, I'm on the same side as General Keane. I think they can do it. But we're not going to know until they do it. And I took a poll of this Marine platoon just before I left. And I said, okay, guys, if you weren't here, could those Afghan soldiers handle it? And it was a 50-50 toss-up among the group when they were arguing. Now, to me, 50-50 was good enough. I would have said, okay, cut them loose and let's see what they can do.
All right. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Bartlett.
Whatever we do in Afghanistan, it will end up the ultimate exercise in futility unless Pakistan controls its tribal border areas with Afghanistan. Because under pressure in Afghanistan, the bad guys will simply go to Pakistan and return so soon as we leave Afghanistan, and we've given them a timetable for when we're going to do that. Does Pakistan have the will and the capacity to control those border areas?
I believe they clearly have the capacity to do it. They've got an accomplished military that's well equipped. They have been spending a lot of time on counterinsurgency training. You know, for an army that's much like ours, was oriented on conventional operations. We have assisted them with some of that transition, and they have improved rather significantly in the execution of them. So yes, they have the capability to do it, but they clearly lack the will to do it. And also, certainly as it affects Afghanistan and the sanctuaries themselves, I mean, they clearly see Afghanistan as part of their strategy with India. And there is a thought that as we continue to make progress in Afghanistan, particularly into 2012, that they would be persuaded that some of their goals as it pertains to Afghanistan, these are Pakistani geopolitical goals as it pertains to Afghanistan, can in fact be achieved with the incumbent government that's there and also the one that would be there post-2014. That'll be quite a diplomatic effort on our part to be able to achieve that in the face of what is now their national interest, and that national interest is supporting the Taliban and the Haqqani network in those sanctuaries. I think this whole thing with Pakistan, as I mentioned in my remarks, has got to be relooked because our current policy has not succeeded. And those sanctuaries, as they currently exist, do protract the war and put us in a situation of unacceptable risk, in my mind, as we continue to move towards 2014.
I'd take a bit of a different view, I think. I've been to Pakistan probably 12 or 15 times. I noted I was there for a week in January. I spent 24 hours up in Peshawar, up on the border areas there. And the first point I make is that Pakistan, when we talk about it, is not a unitary actor, that there are all kinds of factions inside of Pakistan. There are factions inside the Army. There's factions inside the ISI. They don't operate with a singular approach to anything. And so the idea that the will and the capacity problem is not as clear as we might think it to be. The people I visited in Peshawar, the chief law enforcement officer, the governor of Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, they both had friends and relatives being assassinated by the Taliban that were attacking inside of Pakistan. The chief law enforcement officer was having to buy ammunition with his own money for some of his troops. They were at war with an insurgency that was very much related to the insurgency right across the border in Afghanistan. So there are several different layers of fighting that's going on there. As a state, I think Pakistan is conflicted about where it's going and what it wants to do. It does not believe the United States is going to stay in this part of the world, and it is absolutely hedging its bets to be able to have maximum influence after the U.S. is gone. We in some fashion have to break that outlook if we're ever going to see Pakistan improve their policies. But the tribal areas today broadly are like the wild, wild west was for the United States in the 1800s. It is not an area they have a tremendous amount of control over, nothing like I think we expect them to have.
Like General Keane, I would do whatever has to be done to shut down those 2 ammonium nitrate factories. That's just absolutely unacceptable. I think that the new approach to Pakistan of putting everything on a transactional basis, you get this money only if you do something, is the only way to deal with them. And they need that money for their lifestyles. And so we have more leverage than we think we have. And finally, sir, no, I think that fight in the mountains with Pakistan is going to just go on and on and on. But the Taliban have very rudimentary weapons. I notice that Pakistan hasn't been foolish enough to give them modern weapons. So you could see the border, especially in the mountains, ending up a mess for a long, long time, but you still could have some relative stability in Afghanistan. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Langevin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, thank you for your testimony here today and for appearing for us and helping us to flesh out a path for a responsible drawdown in Afghanistan. Maybe 2 questions. First, I've long been concerned about our large troop presence in the country and that we'd be seen more as occupiers than protectors. But now that there's the apparent military successes, at least some successes of the surge, it's imperative that we leverage our victories into strategic gain by slowly transitioning security responsibility now to the Afghan people, as we all recognize. While much of the future success for the war lies in the hands of others, including their regional neighbors, the Afghans themselves obviously will bear the burden for what their country looks like and who is involved in helping rebuild after we draw down in 2014. Now, while numerous reports have highlighted the importance of negotiations with Taliban forces, obviously their resistance to the Afghan government, the assassination of senior leaders, and their stance on human rights makes this difficult. So I want to ask the panel what your assessment is of the incentives for the Taliban to negotiate and what points, if any, the coalition should be ready to accept to keep them at the table. Second, I have a specific question for General Barno. In your testimony, General, you mentioned that one of the challenges facing the United States in Afghanistan is reestablishing working relationships with Pakistan. I'd like your thoughts and the opinions, of course, of the panel, if time permits, on our relationship with Pakistan with respect to providing aid. During General Martin Dempsey's confirmation hearing yesterday, he suggested changing how we view our aid to Pakistan. Specifically, he stated that pushing programs on Pakistanis that they don't desire dilutes the value of U.S. cooperation. So in light of the fact that the Emerging Threats Subcommittee that I sit on recently held a hearing on strategic communications 10 years after 9/11, I believe General Dempsey is right and that we should be discussing this critical issue now as it affects how we are viewed in Pakistan as well as the greater Middle East. So my question is, what are your thoughts about how we currently provide aid to Pakistan, and how could we improve our aid to put the U.S. on a better footing with both the Pakistani government and the populace in general. If we could take Afghanistan first.
Okay. I'll jump on the Afghanistan one and let Dave do the Pakistan. And in terms of reconciliation or negotiations with the Taliban, it's certainly something that we should pursue. Obviously, I don't think it makes as much sense that we're doing it unilaterally and almost right out of the White House itself. After all, the Afghans have a large say here. The Pakistanis also have a say. But I do think it's a bit of an illusion in terms of any near-term achievement of reconciliation for a number of reasons. One, the Taliban themselves have not begun to internalize the fact that they cannot achieve their political goals through armed violence. They haven't accepted that. I'm not convinced there's a single province in Afghanistan that the Taliban could deliver a ceasefire. I mean, we're tracking 16 different insurgent groups under the general rubric of Taliban insurgency, and so it complicates it quite a bit from their perspective. And the other players have a say here also in these negotiations, certainly Pakistan and the Afghan government itself, and even the Afghan government is divided on this issue. So I think we should be grounded in realism when it comes to reconciliation. I know there have been people in our government who have been pursuing this ever since the administration conducted a review of Afghanistan and our future policy and a desire to have it. And certainly that desirable is understandable, but at times it's not grounded in reality. We turn this war to our favor, that is Afghan favor and NATO favor, where we will have a better leverage for this reconciliation that we're attempting to pursue.
On the question of Pakistan, key issue that Pakistan, I think, is arguably the most dangerous country in the world. It's also, by polling, the most anti-American country in the world. So changing those perspectives over time, I think, are essential if we're going to have any kind of relationship with the Pakistani leadership, the Pakistani people. On how to target and adjust aid, I think clearly that aid needs to be better conditioned, especially in the military sphere. We've been essentially, in a lot of ways, writing blank checks to the Pakistanis to reimburse them for military operations. That needs to be much more accountable and have more transparency in terms of how those American dollars are being spent by the Pakistanis. I think that there's been some improvements in that here in the last year that the administration has put into place. On the civilian side, Kerry Lugar Berman money, I think has been a great concept. It has put money in the civilian sphere in terms of development inside of Pakistan. It's underutilized right now. I think we're only spending somewhere in the neighborhood of at 15 or 20% obligation rate on the amount that's been actually appropriated. So there's an issue there. But one of our key objectives should be, I think, to reinforce the civilian government of Pakistan and build their credentials inside the country by using targeted U.S. aid to do that. That's a different set of actors in this non-unitary nation than what we have when we're only reinforcing the military by providing them aid. And I think, again, we've made some progress in that area.
Thank you, thank you, gentlemen, for your testimony. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Thornberry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. General Barno, several of us were in Afghanistan in the spring, looking specifically at the Village Stability Operation, Afghan Local Police initiative. Do you agree with General Keane that it is a game changer or a potential game changer?
I'm a big fan of that program. I think it's been very late getting off the marks. We've had a couple of, even during my era there, we had programs that were analogous to that were stopped after I left because of contentiousness between how the State Department looks at this program and how the Defense Department looks at this program in some respects. So I'm glad to see that underway. Almost any successful counterinsurgency that we can look back over in the last 50 years have had a program like that. So I just hope it's not too late, but it's a program I think we need to reinforce as much as we can.
Yeah. General Keane, I hear some rumblings that there is resistance to this program, at least outside of the theater. And as you know, General Petraeus seems to be a big proponent of it. The folks who are there on the ground have been very strong, but as General Barno kind of alluded, there's some controversy, whether it's State Department, whether it's within the Pentagon or something. Can you help shed some light on that as far as what are the sorts of institutional resistances that we ought to be looking for on this program?
I'm sorry, I can't help. I'm not aware of that. I do know that the program is definitely succeeding. It has been embraced by the Afghan government as well, because all of this eventually is part of the general rubric of the police. The district and provincial governors truly welcome the program. It frankly is succeeding beyond our expectations, and it's the reason I'm so encouraged about it is because the local fighters are selected by the elders. They're picking who they want to defend their communities. We're giving them some basic training to be able to do that, and then we provide oversight and mentorship, for that execution. And we're going to have problems with it. I mean, some of them will be abusive, some of them will be corrupt, and we'll get an expose of it in one of our newspapers, to be sure. But I think by and large that's going to be aberration. The program is really solid. The Taliban are targeting them because they know how threatening they are to their success. But I don't know what's going on institutionally back here in Washington. Sorry, I can't help.
Okay. Well, I think it's the sort of thing we may be doing in more places other than just Afghanistan. So I am interested in the capability beyond just Afghanistan. Secretary West, I want to ask about Pakistan. We're all grappling with this, and you suggest we need much more of a transactional model with them. At the same time, the withdrawal of troops, the 2014 deadline, perhaps putting more conditions on aid, also adds to the insecurity of Pakistan that we're not going to stick around. And if there's one thing you hear over and over again is that they remember when we left, they don't think we're reliable allies. How do you balance all of this with a country that does seem to have such deep felt insecurities, but yet is pivotal to our success?
I wouldn't bother about the balancing, sir. I'd say I have the money, and if you want the money, this is what you're going to do. And if you don't want the money, don't do it.
And you think they need the money bad enough that they will do whatever?
Sir, the way they live, and wonder where the money would come from if they weren't skimming an awful lot of it from international aid. So yes, sir, I do think they need the money.
Yeah. Okay. I appreciate it. Chairman, I'll yield back.
Thank you. Thank you. Mrs. Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I certainly appreciate all of you being here. I think that my colleague, got into this a little bit, but could you go back into the training issue and what we're doing to really sustain that effort when we leave? Are we certain that the kind of tools that we're essentially giving them are ones that they're going to be able to use in the future? And to what extent are we not focusing perhaps on some of the things that we should be? General West, could you respond to that?
I had a combined action platoon. We fought for 485 days with the Vietnamese in a remote village. I've looked at a lot of the battlefields in Iraq and Afghanistan. I'm absolutely convinced that all a trainer and an advisor does more than anything else is he's trying to imbue a sense of confidence into his counterpart that that small unit can dominate on a battlefield and can hold its own. And once he's achieved that, he's achieved everything else. If he can inject in a spirit of dominance, of feeling that they're going to win when they get into a fight with the Taliban, then fine, he's done it. The dilemma then becomes how much can you do and how long does it really take you to do that? Wow. We've been at it now off and on for 10 years, but as I indicated earlier, I think we're getting awfully close to having done it. And you can add the VSOs, the village stability operations to this, fine, the more we can do, the better. But it's as long as we just give them the feeling they can do it. That's what we have to do more than anything else.
Anybody else want to comment?
I would just echo one of the earlier comments that sustaining this financially in the next several years is very important. We heard allusions back to Vietnam, 1972, 1973, General Abrams, and the loss of funding support for the Vietnamese Army. We don't ever like to draw analogies back to that campaign for obvious reasons. But the reality is that unless funding continues to meet the levels required to sustain this Afghan force, then at the same time we're drawing down Americans, we're going to be reducing the capability of the very force that are replacing Americans on the battlefield. So I think continued congressional support for their training and their equipment in the next several years is really important.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the overall effort in terms of financial cost of the war and sustaining it at least into 14, where does that training piece fall? I mean, in numbers and perhaps percentages of what we're doing right now?
The numbers I've seen, I can't absolutely verify these, I've seen in the last couple of days indicate that the amount of money required to sustain the Afghan Army in the next several years is about $6 to $9 billion per year. And again, I don't want to put my name against that, but that's the estimate. And there's also an illusion that we're going to actually resource it at about $4 billion a year is the number I saw. So there may be a delta opening up already between what we know it's going to cost and what we're willing to write the check for back here. Now, that nests within an overall effort of somewhere north of $120 billion a year for Afghanistan. So that's a fairly modest increment of our large financial commitment there, if those numbers are accurate.
General Keane, did you want to?
Sure. There's very specific things that they need to be able to sustain their effort. I totally agree with Bing West about their heart and their commitment to be able to fight. And we are clearly moving in that direction. But frankly, they need helicopters to assist them. They're going to need a couple of C-130s to move them stuff around. And that's all in the plan. I mean, it's already in the financial stream. We just need to continue to make sure that we do that. That counter IEDs, the enemy is using that technology and has killed thousands of us and even more of them. That technology that the enemy is using is not going to go away. And when we walk out the door, we cannot just leave them with their rifles to deal with that technology. We need to leave them with those balloons that are up in the air that you've all seen. We need to leave them with the surveillance technology that we have so they can counter that. That's huge cost savings for us in the long run because we're leaving, but we're leaving them with a capability to be able to execute the mission without us. They need enablers to be able to execute.
I appreciate that. General Keane, I guess part of the difficulty, though, is that they have the ability to actually have the mechanics, to have the logistics, to have all the other pieces in addition to the pilots. And I guess part of the question has been whether, I mean, that's obviously
all those training programs to acquire those skills, obviously, the more sophisticated the skill for a society that is 60–70% illiterate is more challenging. It's taking us a year to get someone through a school that requires sophisticated skills that would take 4 to 6 months back here in the United States for one of our soldiers. But all those programs are in place. And the cost, to echo what General Barno was saying, the total cost is about $6 billion. Of that, about $3 billion would be for the United States. Now, that scale may move, but that's what I was told as of a couple of weeks ago.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Jones.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. And I want to say I agree with you and my colleagues concerned about Pakistan and what we need to do from a diplomatic standpoint to create a better relationship. But I want to go to the next 3.5 years. I want to start very quickly with, on May 26, Lieutenant Colonel Benjamin Palmer and Sergeant Kevin Baldiff, 2 Marines from my district, were shot and murdered by an Afghan trainee. The Sergeant Baldiff had sent his wife, Amy, the day before he was killed, an email. I don't trust them. I don't trust them for anything, not for anything at all. A Marine general who's become a very dear friend of mine, who is retired, continued belief that we can train the Afghan army to be effective in the time we have is nonsense. The vast majority cannot even read. They are people from the villages hooked on drugs, illiterate, and undisciplined. That brings me to a couple more comments, and then I've got one question. Actually, George Will said that, and he was off a little bit, I'm sure, that there are probably 200,000, excuse me, Afghan who are trained to fight, and about 20 Taliban. Now, I realize you said General Keane is about 164,000, or maybe you did, General. But the point is, they're trained, but they don't want to fight. So therefore, Sergeant Baldiff had to give his life, and Colonel Palmer. Well, the only other point, this general, who's become a very dear friend of mine, in asking him about staying there to 2014, I'm not going to read everything because I want to get to a question, but he said, get real with training. In arming a police force, all we are doing is training eventual new members of the Taliban. Trainers are doing a wonderful job, but we don't have the time to make an army. Every day someone dies. I want to know from one of you experts, because I've written to the Department of Defense, how many Americans will probably die or be severely wounded in the next 3.5 years, in your opinion? And if you give me a quick answer, I would appreciate it. Just your ballpark idea. How many will be killed and how many will be wounded in the next 3.5 years? Americans. General Keane. Sir, couldn't hear you.
Excuse me, another 1,000 killed, and 5 or 6 times that, seriously wounded in terms of catastrophic wounds.
Okay.
Let me just
Sir, I want to hear from the other two because my time will run out in just about a minute.
I wouldn't dispute those figures, Congressman.
Just written down Sir, will you speak up, please? I had just written down just about the same figures. About 1,000 would probably die, and about 7,000 would be seriously wounded. Okay. The point is, if we're in 2014, let's say President Obama is still president, or we have a new president, and they decide, the Department of Defense, that no, we need to stay just a little bit longer, to 2015, 2016, what would you be saying to a committee 3 years down the road about the Afghans? Are they ready now, 3 years later, to take over the fight, or we're going to still have to be there in large presence to make sure that they fight? And this will be my last question, obviously.
Yep. Well, just in terms of some feedback, I think your characterization of the Afghans, using that very dramatic and tragic example, is overly pessimistic and doesn't square with what we are seeing universally and generally speaking. Exceptions all over the place, to be sure. But our judgment tells us, based on experience that we've had with years in Iraq with that force and years with this force. And
General, excuse me 1 minute. We're saying to the Iraqis right now, do you want us to stay there another year or two?
Mm-hmm. What our judgment is telling us is that based on what we see now with the Afghan National Security Forces, we should be encouraged, and that we can go forward and begin the transition with them carefully, but begin that transition with them, and we will find out whether that judgment is correct or not.
General.
And I think we have a stair step down over the next 3.5 years. It's already been laid out that takes us to full Afghan ownership, not all at the end of 2014, but in steps between now and then. We need to measure that as we go, and we'll have a very good estimation of whether that's working or not 6 months from now, 9 months from now, 12 months from now, and we need to look at that carefully.
Colonel. I've been on record for some time now of saying that I think we should have fewer of our own fighters there and more trainers in advisors with them, but right now the ratio is 1 American soldier to 2 Afghan soldiers. I'd like to see it be 1 American soldier to 10 Afghan soldiers. Thank you, sir. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Cooper.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I admire each one of you gentlemen, but I think there's only one of you who doesn't fit into a bureaucracy very well. I think that's Mr. West, and I mean that as a compliment. Because not only are you a writer, and I would commend to people your book, Afghanistan, the Wrong War, but your willingness to be embedded repeatedly at the platoon level is pretty remarkable. And when I get time sometime, I want to find out I think you described it as the Nantucket of Afghanistan, exactly what the chain of command was that sent U.S. troops to a village with no strategic importance just because Hamid Karzai wanted them to go there to defend vacation properties for the Kabul elite. But more serious matters. Here we are 10 years into war, and even if you count all the folks who've come and gone, we can barely muster a majority on the Armed Services Committee to find out what's going on in Afghanistan. General West pointed out that I think we've had 10 generals in command in Afghanistan in 10 years. Several of you are veterans of committee testimony, and you've seen, year in, year out. Now, every time we're hopeful and we're going to do a little bit better, even though troop levels have changed so dramatically, it's hard for folks back home to understand. If we peel back the 30,000 in the so-called surge, we will still have over twice as many troops there as were ever there under the previous administration. Plus, you throw in the 40,000 NATO troops, and you kind of wonder what they're doing, too. It makes me appreciate the plain-speaking approach of General West. He says in his testimony that he thinks that a lot of Afghans are chameleons. And this isn't to fault anyone, it's just that, it's the nature of the situation and of the people. And when General Keane says, well, they're getting a divorce from the Taliban, well, some people get remarried. Some people cohabit. Some people didn't really mean it to begin with. So I think the country is getting more than fatigued with this situation, as my colleague Walter Jones points out. The death toll, the casualty rate for what is tougher and tougher for people to take, especially when we have such an ambiguous relationship with Pakistan across the border. I am hopeful that we can have military policies in the future that are more consistent, and generals that plan and stick to approaches instead of, we've gone from 10,000 troops there to 130,000 troops, and I'm still not sure we've properly understood the nature of the enemy. We built them a dam in the 1950s that has barely been properly operated. The Russians gave them helicopters, and there's still Russian pilots in country, as you gentlemen know, ferrying people around because the Afghans never learned to pilot those helicopters. And the assumption that training will work assumes a Western sort of mindset that, they are literate and they are trainable and they will not immediately flip sides to the other side with our money. So somehow we have to have better solutions, and I think it boils down to understanding the nature of the enemy, and I don't know anybody who understands that better than Mr. West, who's actually been there on the ground, walking the ditches with the troops. So I hope more members will pay attention to this issue in general and to his writings in particular, because to me at least they have the ring of truth, and I just fly in every year or two, see what's going on. But I don't know anybody, at least on this panel, who's spent more on-the-ground experience than Mr. West. So I appreciate you calling him as a witness, Mr. Chairman, and I hope that we can get a better and quicker solution to this problem. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank all of you for being here today. General Keane, I was really looking forward to your appearance. Over the years, you've been here numerous times, and I hope that people will look back. Every time you've been here, you've been very realistic, you've been very visionary, you've been very accurate. And in the entire global war on terrorism, you've added so much to help promote stability and success, protecting American families at home by having success overseas. And so I appreciate your fortitude. You've even been ahead of the curve. I appreciate sometimes you've been politically incorrect. So thank you for what you've done. And then, General Barno, I want to thank you for your personal service. And then you mentioned your two sons. All of us back in South Carolina are very appreciative of your commanding Fort Jackson. You really set a standard for the young people who have the opportunity to serve our country. Additionally, I want to thank you in 2003. You were my host as the commander of forces in Afghanistan. I want to thank you for your service there. It was really eye-opening. I've been there 11 times. I've seen an extraordinary development of the security forces in that country and the development really of a civil society in the third poorest country on earth. But as we look at this, and when the President's right, I was very appreciative of commending the surge, and we've seen the success of that, as Secretary Beng has indicated. With the drawdown, does the United States, General Barno, have sufficient forces in place to support the Afghan efforts to hold in the south and clear in the east?
My sense is that they do. I think, as I noted earlier, the commanders are going to be limited in what flexibility they would have had if they had those forces through the end of next year. I think the numbers coming out this year, the 10,000 that will be out by the end of December, that can be readily accommodated by plans that were already in place. Next year, I think it's going to be much more difficult for commanders, not that the troops are departing, but that they're departing early enough in the year that it's going to have an impact over the fighting season. Is that going to cause the effort there to collapse? No. Is it going to increase the risk on the ground and make it more difficult? Yes.
And you and I both, as very proud fathers of people serving in the military today, at breakfast I had a family member of a person serving in Afghanistan. They were expressing concern about the current rules of engagement. Do you feel that the rules of engagement enable our forces to be as effective as they need to be and also can protect themselves?
I might ask General Keane to comment on this, who's just come back. My sense is that we had some difficulties with our rules of engagement about 2 years ago, that they were too restrictive and they were being interpreted too restrictively at lower levels. I think that was changed last summer. General Petraeus reviewed that when he came in, made some significant adjustments. So my sense is that today that those are about right. Always subject to misinterpretation by people that are a little overzealous. But General Keane may have a current view on that.
And General, what message would you have to military families on this issue?
Well, I spent a lot of time on this visit, with platoons and companies who were in the fight, and it was not an issue for them. And it has not been an issue, I think, based on General Barno's comment, since General Petraeus ordered the entire review of this issue. And they did find that as the rules of engagement cascaded down from the top, that there were more restrictive measures being imposed by intermediate commanders. And that, while I'm not going to suggest that that's totally removed, I didn't see any evidence of concern about it. So in terms of military family members, I mean, first of all, their youngsters are being extremely well led, and highly capable and motivated leaders are out there working with them day in and day out, and they are very well resourced as well. And this is a resource in a sense, because how you use rules of engagement and apply combat power is crucial, to the mission and to their success and to their survival. So I'm pretty comfortable with what I've seen, and the family should be as well.
And thank you for those reassuring words, because there are family members very, very concerned. And I shared the same feeling you did, that the extraordinary leadership really gives you confidence in our troops. I yield the balance.
May I make a, if I could, there's another part, though, that I think is disturbing. Do you know that our soldiers and Marines are not permitted to arrest any insurgents? Not permitted to do it. And that gets me pretty darn mad, because you're out there and you can kill somebody, but you can't arrest them. And I think people should look very carefully at how we ever got ourselves into a situation of fighting a war where you can't arrest anybody, because there are fewer people in prison in Afghanistan per capita than there are in Sweden. So we're trying to say that Afghanistan is more stable than Sweden. We've gotten ourselves, because of the backlash of what happened in the prisons going all the way back to Abu Ghraib, etc., we worked ourselves into a corner where we literally have put handcuffs on our own troops along these lines. That has nothing to do with the rule of engagement. It was just I couldn't resist saying it, because it does affect morale, and it should be stopped. Somebody should really take a careful look at what we're doing to incarcerate and keep in prison those who are killing us.
Thank you. Mr. Courtney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Actually, Secretary West, maybe you could just sort of tease that out a little bit more. If it's not the rules of engagement that is the, I mean, you just said it was not the rules of engagement that was creating that barrier. Is there some other restriction?
Yes, sir. Bluntly, it is a rule of engagement. And it's a rule of engagement that started because our NATO allies insisted on it, and we gradually picked up on it because they didn't want to have anything to do with anybody being in prison. So you turn them over to the Afghan system, and the Afghan system lets about 9 out of every 10 of them walk free after a little money passes while it's going through the chain of command. So that whole thing redounds. It's a rule of engagement that hurts because it leaves people on a battlefield that still want to kill you.
And it's being driven by, again, the NATO alliance?
It is driven on the one hand by the politics of our own NATO alliance, including our own politics, and on the other hand because it fits in very well with Karzai's hypothesis that there's no such thing as a Taliban, there are just wayward brothers, which has something to do with the whole way in which Pashtuns do business with Pashtuns. You put it all together and you end up with very few people staying in jail for over a year, even though they have been part of the IED groups that have killed Americans.
Thank you. I'm sure that's going to get some of our attention. When Mr. Smith was asking questions earlier, General Keane, again, this question of, you know, what's the transition balance that works. Admiral Mullen, in his last appearance before our committee on this issue, reflected towards the end of the hearing on the experience in Iraq, which, again, you showed great leadership in your testimony back in 07 and 08. And it reminded us that when the Status of Forces Agreement was negotiated, which, again, had a timeline for a drawdown, frankly, there were a lot of voices, even within military and certainly within the Congress, who were questioning whether or not the risk level was too high in terms of the SOFA plan. And you know, his observation was that deadlines really do work, that, you know, pushing the Iraqis to have to step it up, and obviously the experience in the Kurdish north where General Odierno was kind of on the hot seat for a while there about whether or not to follow through with the SOFA, the timeline, and he made a pretty gutsy call to hang tough and to stick with it. I mean, in retrospect, I mean, Admiral Mullen was actually saying that that was actually a very beneficial factor in terms of forcing an increase in Iraqi capability. And so, I mean, listening to Mr. West's testimony about 1 to 10, you know, would be his sort of preference right now. I mean, it just doesn't strike me that the drawdown that we're talking about here is really, we're in a zone that should be portrayed that negatively, because I just feel that, again, using your experience, I mean, we saw that, in fact, deadlines do have a beneficial effect. And I just thought maybe you might comment on Admiral Mullen's observation.
No, I totally agree. And you remember the commanders did, when it came to the Status of Forces Agreement in Iraq, they did agree with those timelines based on the experience that they were having. And here, we already have the timeline. I mean, the timeline is 2014. So what my comments dealt with is, and I agree with the commanders, General Petraeus and his team wanted to have approximately the same level of forces that we have now through this fighting season that we're currently in and through next fighting season 2012. That was the issue, to be able to achieve our objectives in the East with the appropriate level of forces and still meet the 2014 drawdown schedule with the entire Afghan National Security Forces being in the lead by that time. That's the difference that my testimony reflects. The second thing is dealing with the much larger issue here, and General Barno mentioned it in his testimony, and it's a huge elephant in the room in terms of our stick-to-itiveness and our commitment to the region and to Afghanistan and, in a sense, to Pakistan. And that is that we're staying. I'm not suggesting we're staying at force levels we have, but we are committed to the future security and stability of Afghanistan and part of the region. So what is being negotiated right now is the Strategic Partnership Agreement. Think of that as what we did in Iraq was the Strategic Framework Agreement with the Iraqis, which I always thought was actually more important than the SOFA agreement because it established a long-term partnership relationship. That's what this is. we get that done, that'll be very important because it'll establish an enduring relationship with us to Afghanistan and, in a sense, to the region at large, which people out there clearly have to hear. And that's not what they hear right now.
But that's not necessarily. Oh, okay, I'll follow up with that.
Thank you, Mr. Kaufman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. General Keane, General Barno, and Secretary West, thank you all for your service. And I think my question would be, how do you define our security objectives in Afghanistan? And let me put out 3 elements to that and see if you all concur. It's to keep Al-Qaeda out, to keep the Taliban from taking over the country, and to provide a permissive environment for which we can strike at targets in Pakistan. Would you all define our security objectives in the same way, or how would you differ? General Keane?
No, I wouldn't disagree with that. I would just add to that part of the security objective is clearly to be able to transition the Afghan National Security Forces so that they can protect their own people and their own national interests.
General Barno?
The way I'd modify that, I think, is to take it up a few feet to a regional level and say, in the region, what are we going to try and accomplish through our actions in Afghanistan in the coming years? And I think there's 3 vital interests we have out there. And yours, I think, fall very well within this. One is prevent Al-Qaeda or associated groups from striking the United States again. Secondly, to prevent weapons of mass destruction, nuclear weapons in particular, from falling into the hands of terrorists in this region, read from Pakistan. And then third is to really prevent a nuclear war between Pakistan and India, prevent vast instability in that part of the world that could spill over and impact the United States. And so I think your objectives within Afghanistan very much fit into that, so I would agree.
Secretary West? Thank you. Well, then let me ask you this question, because it seems sometimes that we've gone beyond our objectives, and that is it really in our interest, or how does it fit within these objectives to try to have we given them a governance that looks more like us and less like them in terms of fitting into their political culture? Are we trying to restructure their society? When I was there last, there was a program, women's engagement, using military personnel, saying that in a conservative Islamic society, we were trying to raise the status of women, and then so restructuring their society and giving them the economy that we haven't, that they've never had through U.S. aid. Are those elements, first of all, do you think I've accurately described some of our objectives in addition to what the security objectives that we talked about? And number 2, are they achievable? General Keane?
Well, I don't think they're an accurate reflection of what we're trying to do. I think we've scaled down our objectives rather considerably, and that largely deals with security and a capable Afghan National Security Forces that can take over from us. Are we trying to shape and influence some other things in Afghanistan in terms of the current government and the incumbency that we have and the problems of corruption we have with Karzai? Sure, certainly. It makes sense that we do that. Have we supported some of the donor programs to help to improve society in Afghanistan? We certainly have. But I don't see us involved in Afghanistan in a long-term nation-building exercise. And I think we have scaled back our goals quite considerably.
General Barno?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think we had some probably extremely optimistic goals in 2001, 2002 in Afghanistan. Some of those have been realized. You've got a reasonable constitution, one of the most moderate constitutions in the Islamic world. You have an elected parliament and president. I was there for the first election of Karzai and helped prepare the second one. Those were very good elections. 10.5 million Afghans registered, 8.5 million voted. So democracy in their own version is definitely something that they're actually quite enthused about there. But I also don't think we're now of the opinion that we have the resources nor the time to try and rebuild an entire functioning state there, that we're going to try and look at it more in a much more limited sense than we were 6, 7, 8 years ago.
Secretary West?
I only wish that were true. I wrote a book called The Wrong War, saying that our strategy of nation building was Afghanistan was the wrong war to do that. I haven't seen any evidence that we have changed on the ground. Everything that we're doing last year and the year before we're doing this year. We're still out there doing the governance. We're still out there giving away the money. We're still out there saying we're going to have a rule of law, and we're still out there giving them security. So we're still full scale ahead in nation building and spending more money on it.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Recognize Mr. Johnson at this time.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, I recall during the time that the President was considering whether or not to order a troop surge into Afghanistan, there was an appearance on 60 Minutes by General Stanley McChrystal, who was the commander of the U.S. forces in Afghanistan. Do each of you recall that?
I don't recall it. But
I didn't see the program, but I recall him appearing.
Okay. Do any of you have any knowledge as to whether or not the President actually authorized General McChrystal to take the issue public?
I don't know, sir.
I don't know the answer to that.
Well, would it have been the proper thing to do to gain, for a military officer under the control of the Commander-in-Chief, would it not have been a breach of protocol, to put it lightly, some might say insubordination, to actually go on TV and tell the American people that we needed a troop surge of 40,000 troops before the President had even made his decision? Was that an act of insubordination, or at least a breach of protocol, if he did it without authority?
Well, let me answer that. I know General McChrystal very well, and that is totally out of character for General McChrystal to even suggest that he would try to leverage his president by making public statements. I do remember this. I do remember him responding to a question. I thought it was at a news conference. I thought it was after he made a speech, and he responded to some questions, and they asked his opinion, about the level of forces.
That's not the interview that I'm referring to. It was a sit-down interview.
And I know, as I said before, I know McChrystal really well.
So you would speculate that that he had authority to do that?
No. What I'm speculating is that McChrystal had no malice intent here.
Yeah,
that he responded to a question honestly, and he was not intending to leverage his president.
Okay.
If he had to do it over again, he would not have responded with that answer.
I understand. Does anybody have a different take on that?
I would just note that military officers, to include our commanders in the theater, make public appearances. General McChrystal, I know, went to London. He spoke at the International Institute of Strategic Studies. The questions he got were following his speech there. The speech he gave would have been approved, and the fact he was there would have been approved. So I think that may be the context behind what your thoughts are.
So in other words, then that was a political, politics was involved in that decision. You are suggesting, and I suggest that we've heard comments today about the decision to draw down the troops was made on a political basis. And I submit that that is wholly in keeping with the decision that was made at the very beginning of this surge, which I believe has been somewhat successful. So the drawdown that the President, as Commander-in-Chief, has decided, looking at all factors, including political realities, the drawdown is something that he decided, and we should respect that decision. Does anybody have anything to contest in what I have said?
Well, I don't want to speak for anyone else, but I don't think, given our backgrounds, that any of us would dispute the President's right to make that decision and weigh all the factors in that decision. But we're being asked to come before this committee to provide some advice and counsel about what is the future in Afghanistan and what are the risks. And what I identified, I'll speak for myself, I'm saying that decision of 33,000 by next September has considerably increased the risk based on my analysis.
And I can appreciate that.
And I got to be straight up about it.
I can appreciate that, and I'm not demeaning anyone's opinion here about what decision was made, but I'm just simply defending the President's right to make the decision and also putting that decision into the proper light, given what happened at the very beginning of the decision to do the surge was made. And I thank you, and I yield back.
I recognize the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Whitman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, General Keane, General Barno, Secretary West, thank you so much for joining us today. I want to go back to one of the strategic questions that was asked, and Secretary West, get your perspective on this. Just as you've heard, the current course of action, the strategic plan currently appears to be in RC East. And of course, having visited there and talking to those commanders in both RC East and RC South, I know the effort now is to clear RC East, go after the Haqqani network, and then in RC South continue the clear and hold policy, and then institute the Afghan National Security Forces in that particular region. All this going on with a termination date of 2014 and a troop drawdown of 33,000 by 2012. My question is can we continue to maintain success in that regional strategy of continuing to clear and hold RC South, but continuing to be aggressive in RC East to clear under that strategy? Do you believe that we are going to be able to do that under the current troop drawdown framework?
Well, sir, if that's what General Petraeus wanted to do, and that's what General Allen wants to do, that's fine with me, because you only have one commander-in-chief at a given time. He has a huge staff, and you know, that's if that's the plan, because sure. I don't know, but if that's the plan, I'd fall in on the plan.
Okay, very good. General Barno?
Yeah, again, I'm certain that General Allen's going to do an assessment now that he's on the ground out there, and he's going to have to weigh, his resources with the plan that he was, given when he arrived there, and make his own decision on that. I can't really prejudge where that's going to go. And again, I go back to the question of the key to this may be how effective Afghan forces are in stepping up to the plate here in the coming year.
Sure.
Yeah, that's clearly what the intent is, and General Allen, as General Barno indicated, along with his staff, is assessing all of that as we speak. And listen, we know a lot about the East because we've been there with U.S. forces since the inception. Mm-hmm. So we know where the major mobility corridors are that really do threaten Kabul and where the major safe havens are. We're also a lot smarter about what not to do up there. Yeah. And General West indicated some of that. Yeah. And that is to get lost up in the mountain with those villages that have been there for centuries, and not much is going to be changed by it. Sure. That's not what this effort will be about. Sure. So it'll be a priority of effort with the appropriate level of resources and hopefully an acceptable level of risk.
General Keane, General Barno, let me get your perspective from a tactical standpoint then. If you look at what's going on in RC East, and of course had an opportunity to visit there and talk to the commanders on the ground, and there's some challenges there, obviously. Do you see in the mix of conventional forces and special operations forces, where do you, in your opinion, see that going? Do you see there being a 50-50 mix? Do you see there being more of a special operations character to the tactical efforts there in RC East? And the reason I ask that is because I think it's a pretty dynamic environment there, and if we're going to be drawing down forces, we need to make very sure that we are spot on as far as the deployment of the existing forces that we have as that drawdown takes place.
Well, our special operations forces actually represent a very small part of our force levels, as you know. Mm-hmm. On average, we conduct 10 or 15 operations a night, most of them at night, going after what you know we refer to as high-value targets. And sometimes it's an individual, sometimes it's more than an individual. Those operations will continue for some time. And the overwhelming number of operations in terms of Afghan National Security Forces and ISAF forces operating in RC East or RC South will dominate by far what our Special Operations Forces are doing. But I think what you'll see as we get closer to 2014 and we're transitioning to ANSF and we're having less involvement ourselves, our Special Operations Forces, I would imagine, will still have a pretty full plate, just as they do in Iraq today.
Sure. General Barno?
Yeah, I would defer to how General Allen looks at that and what kind of trade-offs he makes, but I think that's exactly right. One of the things I do project us seeing in Afghanistan is a steady state commitment of our Special Operations Forces while our conventional forces draw down over the next several years and are replaced in many ways by Afghan forces.
Follow up with one quick question on that. How do you see collectively the U.S. evaluating the efforts of the surge from 2009 through 2011 and looking at what needs to happen in RC East? Do you see a similar surge scenario having to happen in RC East in order to combat the Haqqani network, which, as you know, is really the big challenge in that particular region?
I think, to use the term that we're most familiar with, the operation in the South became our main effort to include Helmand and Kandahar province. And by that we mean it normally is a greater application of resources against an opponent. And is given a series of priorities of effort. That is what will happen in the East. It'll become main effort. It'll receive priority of resources, priority of surveillance, lots of effort in that area. Not all of it will necessarily mean additional brigades that have to go there. A lot of enablers will go there that are now in the South or someplace else. So it'll become main effort, and it'll receive the priority of effort of the command.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Recognize Ms. Hanabusa.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary West, when you made the statement you don't know what counterinsurgency or counterterrorism mean, you made me feel really good because I have the same problem. So to the two generals, I'd like to ask you, when we say that we are changing the military strategy from counterterrorism, from counterinsurgency, what exactly does that mean to you, or you can explain it to me, and maybe to Secretary West? And in addition to that, can you tell me what that's going to look like for basically our strength, our end strength, or what the forces are going to look like, and also what the composition may be, so that as we see the drawdown in Afghanistan and this new military strategy that's being employed now, what is it that we need to understand as to what the needs may be or the reduction would result? So any one of you. And I don't mean to be insulting to you.
I'm very interested too. You know, these choice of words have been unfortunate from the very beginning, that people started to use them and started to use them as different strategies in particular. And I think that's where they become they're just not useful. To be frank about it, I think to maybe understand the difference as we are applying these terms. Counterinsurgency, the emphasis is on protecting the people as job one. And certainly there's an enemy out there that we have to deal with. But the principle involved is the protection of the people. In counterterrorism, the focus is exclusively on the enemy. And the way we apply it, it is mostly focused on individuals, what we call high-value targets, and less on organizations. And we are able to execute those targets based on very specific intelligence that we receive. Actually, to conduct a successful campaign against the insurgents in Iraq or in Afghanistan, you would have to do both of these to be successful. I cannot, for the life of me, see how we could just conduct operations against high-value targets and believe that we could be successful and ignore the rest of the problem. But I think the terms are not particularly useful in trying to understand what we're doing.
General Barno, do you have anything to add?
I guess the only thing I would add is that, and I'll talk maybe about future forces since you asked about that too. But I viewed when I structured a counterinsurgency strategy when I was there, the first one that we had really applied there, I had the counterterrorism element of that as one of the pillars of the strategy. That focusing on the enemy was one of the aspects of a broader counterinsurgency strategy, within which you had a governance pillar, within which you had a build Afghan security forces pillar, within which you had a regional pillar, and you looked at protecting the population and having an integrated overall effort. But you always have to have both. I mean, again, I agree. You can't have a counterinsurgency that doesn't have striking the enemy as part of it, but the broader context has to do with protecting the population from the enemy and separating the population from the enemy. To your question on the future, very briefly, I think that ultimately where this will take us is that we're going to see the counterinsurgency element of what we're doing, the population protection, countering the Taliban element, become more and more Afghan-centric. I think we're going to continue our own counter-terrorist forces striking at both the Taliban leadership and the Al-Qaeda leadership for a long time. And that may be our end game there, may be mostly, if not exclusively, CT forces, special ops forces, with the Afghan army with some advisors. And I think that's where our strategy ultimately takes us at the end of 2014.
And just so that I'm clear, General Keane, when you said that it's to protect the people, the counterinsurgency, strategy, is that the Afghan people, or is that our people in uniform?
No, that's certainly the Afghan people is center stage to that, and that's a shorthand way of explaining a more complicated strategy.
So, given that you're both retired, and I hope I can get some candid answers, so why would we in Congress, who latch on to these nice little terms of art, so to speak, we've been told that there's a change. We were going from the counterinsurgency strategy to the counterterrorism strategy, and some of us have used it because of testimony that we received. So can you tell me why then, if it's really sort of both two sides of the same coin almost, or yin and yang, both necessary, why is it that we're being told that the military strategy has now changed its focus, if you know?
I don't think that the military strategy has changed its focus in Afghanistan. I think there's been a debate over the last 2 years whether the military should simply abandon counterinsurgency, remove the bulk of the troops, and then only have special operations forces doing counterterrorism against Al-Qaeda, maybe even doing it from offshore, not in Afghanistan. I think
like Libya.
Well, hopefully not like Libya in some ways, but the outcome of that debate was no, that's not adequately going to protect U.S. security interests, and we had to have boots on the ground, and we had to be able to prosecute both components of this campaign. So I think, again, ultimately post-2014, we may have a counter-terrorist strategy focused on Al-Qaeda, but between now and then, we're looking at having both of these very much interconnected to each other.
So quickly, will we then, of course, then see the reduction in force? The end strength will, of course, naturally reduce because of that nature and that change?
Yeah, absolutely, and that's the game plan right now, is that we move from large number of American boots on the ground we have today to a much smaller number by the end of 2014 that will ultimately simply be focused on counterterrorism and Al-Qaeda, with the Afghans taking on all the ownership with some American support of the counterinsurgency effort against the Taliban.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My time has expired, so I yield back.
Thank the lady and recognize the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Platts, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to first thank all three of our witnesses for being here and for your service to our country. Mr. Whitman from Virginia touched on a good part of what I wanted to focus on, and so I'll try not to be repetitive. I guess the one issue, and General Keane, in your testimony, you addressed specifically the drawdowns of 10,000 and 23 additional by September of next year. My position on the issue of our troops in Iraq and Afghanistan have always been based on facts on the ground. And when we had the surge in Afghanistan, December of 2009, with the announcement, it was that we're going to increase with the hope of drawing down by this summer, but with a caveat facts on the ground will guide what we do. If the President believes that facts today justify the 10,000, that's one thing, but is the fact that we're already assuming what the facts will be in 2012 and saying we'll draw down another 23,000 raises concern to me. In your testimony, you talk about, and I forget how you exactly word it, but at a minimum, I think you said, delaying it to December of 2012. I read from that you think that planned 23,000 is premature or too much based on what we know today versus what may happen in the coming year. Is that a fair understanding?
Yes, I do. I mean, I think the number is excessive given what the conditions on the ground are, what need to be done, and it drives up the risk considerably. And obviously, General Petraeus, who had considerably more knowledge than all of us, felt the same. The point I was making that we now have the decision, and we're obviously going to mitigate that risk as much as possible. One of the ways we could mitigate it, it would seem to me, is to keep the 23,000 that we're going to take out next year in the fight through the fighting season, which will end in the fall. And that would require going back to the Secretary of Defense and to the President and asking for 90 days extension on that number. And that keeps that force level high through the fighting season. And obviously we would get the kind of results from that and reduce the risk. That is something that I think is not unreasonable. Whether the President would entertain that or whether General Allen believes that's necessary, I don't know. He's doing an assessment as we speak.
The other point made for all three of you is one of the keys as training up the Afghan security forces certainly is the benefit of them being partnered with our forces, so not just through the basic training, but actually in the field. And the drawdown this year of 10,000 and 23,000 means that there's going to be significantly less opportunities for that type of partnering to occur in the field versus just making sure they have good training, basic training. Is that a fair concern that is going to be an impact of what we're doing, that in the field partnering so that we don't kind of finish the job in the training up of who ultimately is going to need to provide for the security, the Afghans themselves?
I think it's not entirely clear that that'll be the direct effect. I mean, and that'll be based upon where the forces are that are drawn out. If they're drawn out, in the case of this year, from northern Afghanistan, for instance, the necessity of partnering there may be less important than it is, obviously, in the south and the east. And then the other thing I think to point out is that unless things have changed, a large number of American forces aren't currently partnered with Afghan forces. So it's not necessarily going to be a one-to-one correlation, I don't believe.
Okay.
I don't see it as a major issue. The main effort will be in the east, and I think they'll accelerate the number of Afghan security forces probably there much more so than they had originally intended to do because of this reduction of ISAF forces. And I think there'll be plenty of opportunity to partner with Afghans and for them to get the benefit that partnership, at least to this date, has been pretty positive.
Great. Thank again all three of you for your testimony, but especially your service over many years. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Gary Mendy, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Generals, thank you very much for your long service to America and your continued concern and participation in helping us define our strategies. General West, your view that we ought to be drawing down our troops is one that I share, but very little discussion here today about negotiations amongst the Taliban. We've talked a little bit about the role of Pakistan in that process. Could you, General West, expand on the issue of negotiations? Should there be negotiations? What are we going to do? I know General Keane said there's 16 different groups out there that we generally lump as Taliban. Could you talk to me about this?
Sir, I have no competence in it, so I'll just say that I'm just, typical Marine, hard-nosed. beat them first and then negotiate with them would be my attitude.
Can we beat them?
Certainly don't want to see any Mr. Kissinger having peace like he did in 1972. I'd use the word Hezbollah. I can't conceive of the Taliban really being honest negotiators with you, that they're going to give up their right to shoot you in the back. So I look at them, even if they were part of a government or anything, as being just like the Hezbollah in Lebanon, that they and the Afghan army will remain under any conceivable circumstance mortal enemies.
Did you say the Afghan army?
Sure. The only institutional force that I can see in Afghanistan that can hold it all together, and we're well on our way to doing it, is the Afghan army. So if you have this institutional force that believes it's protecting the nation, and then you bring in people like the Taliban, one group or another, and you know that even regardless of what they promise, they still somehow are a group that is sinister, then you're going to have this tension whether or not you have negotiations.
Now, the Afghan army is made up of multiple ethnic, religious groups, is it not?
Certainly hope so. Yes, sir. I mean,
their allegiance is to whom?
See, that's really interesting, and we won't know until they're put to the test without us being there holding their hands.
And it seems to me their current allegiance may be to the paycheck that we're providing.
Well, that's why I suggested a lockbox, so that they know that General Allen can continue to pay them, and the person after General Allen can continue to pay them, because he who has the gold rules.
That's a very dicey situation, that the allegiance of the Army is really to the paycheck that America gives to them, and that's some $8 to $10 billion a year, forevermore. Does the U.S. Institute of Peace play any role in trying to resolve some of these issues and move us forward?
I've actually worked with them quite a bit over the last several years, and I've found them to be very useful. They don't get a lot of publicity about what they're doing, but they have a tremendously useful behind-the-scenes role in reaching out and touching some of these groups, bringing it together and convening elements that wouldn't have the opportunity to do that, and organizing some of these efforts that I think may ultimately be very helpful to our long-term transition in Afghanistan. So I'm a fan of them. I think they're a pretty effective organization.
And I think also Pakistan would be similarly situated. They play a role there.
They certainly do. And I've been involved with some of their efforts with Pakistan.
Thank you. One final question in the last minute, 7 seconds. And that has to do with the penultimate goal here. Is it to build a nation, or is it to protect America and our allies from terrorist attacks? Start with General West. I'm not sure your microphone's on.
I would say that we are there for our own interest to avoid terrorist attacks against us. The way to do that is to have a strong Afghan army, even if the politics over there are all screwed up.
Yeah, I would agree. I think the United States is in this region to protect U.S. vital national security interests, and those transcend just what we're doing right now in Afghanistan.
This has always been about the American people. Our troops understand that. That's why they're willing to go back time and time again. It's our security that's at stake here.
I thank you, gentlemen. It seems to me that it is the terrorist attacks that took us there in the first place. Building a nation there is a difficult task, one that has never been achieved by anybody, and that we should continue our focus like a laser on the terrorists wherever they happen to be. Thank you very much, gentlemen.
Recognize the gentleman from Arkansas, Mr. Griffin, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for your service. Thank you for being here today. I'll address this question initially to you, Secretary West, but if any of y'all want to chime in, that'd be great. We've heard someone here today, and I'm not sure exactly who it was, allude to the possibility of infiltration of the Taliban into the ANSF. And I'm wondering if you think the threat of infiltration of the Taliban getting into the ANSF, if you think that that is a Those are isolated incidents. If you think there is a threat of significant infiltration, particularly as we are drawing down, and I'd be interested to know what specific, if you do think it's a threat, what specific steps we are taking to make sure that we're tracking this.
Sir, it is a problem. I don't think it's hugely significant, but it is a problem because if it begins to get in the minds of our advisors, then it becomes a bigger problem. But I've been out with the Afghan Army with our advisors when they've grabbed different guys, and they're trying to find out if the Taliban. And I was surprised to see how difficult it is. One Afghan lieutenant just turned to me one day and he said, they're magnificent liars. So you can have some of them in there and you wouldn't even know it. I know that we're trying to take steps to guard against that. In the end, you can never guard against it 100%. I don't see it as being that large a problem, but you can't let it start to play with your mind.
I think right now there are isolated instances, but they're very concerning because they do undermine American confidence in the Afghan units they're working with. That's very dangerous. I think broadly the Afghan Army has a very strong internal inoculation against sympathy towards the Taliban. They are the bulwark in that country between the Taliban and the Taliban taking over their government outside of the international forces. So I think there's some very strong DNA they have that are going to make them broadly very institutionally resistant to this taking any roots there.
Yeah, I don't see it as a future major problem at all, and quite the opposite is happening, not on the scale we found in Iraq, certainly, but it is beginning to grow now in Afghanistan, and that is Taliban fighters turning sides and coming over, and the word is reintegration is the policy term that describes it. And more of that is happening. I mean, the program is constipated by the bureaucracy in Afghanistan government, to be frank about it. But there are plenty of opportunities now, particularly for local fighters who are less ideologically aligned, to go back to what they were doing before they became a fighter and to reintegrate into society.
I was there in Afghanistan over Memorial Day, and there was a lot of talk about reintegration, and particularly, as you say, for folks who may have been in the Taliban for practical reasons. They're just local and looking for a group with which to be affiliated, and are not real interested in the ideology. It's been pretty easy to pull those folks back. So you're not concerned as we draw down that this would be a problem in the leadership ranks, because that's where I could see there being substantial erosion of the police force. But it sounds like you're not too worried about it. Thank you all.
I recognize the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Andrews, for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Gentlemen, thank you for your service to our country. And thank you for your contributions to our committee over the years. You've really been a great source of information. We appreciate all three of you. General West, you state something I agree with, which is our fundamental national security goal in Afghanistan is preventing a terrorist safe haven inside Afghanistan. I agree with that. And I would sort of ask the question these days, a safe harbor for whom? Recent news reports have indicated substantial degradation in Al-Qaeda's capabilities. I'd like to ask each of the panel your own assessment of Al-Qaeda's capabilities today, whether you agree or disagree with those reports. And second, if there are other forces besides Al-Qaeda that you worry about taking root in those sanctuaries and using them to attack the United States. And General, if you'd like to start, I'd like to hear from all three of you.
This will be very brief, sir, because I'm not in that intelligence loop. But I can tell you, when they get on the battlefields inside Afghanistan, I noticed both in the south and in the north, you get the immediate rumor that there's somebody who's speaking either with a Pakistani accent, and occasionally you get a rumor that there's an Arab. So they don't exactly fit in. So I see them as being pretty isolated when they come into Afghanistan.
General?
I think that I'm a bit of a skeptic on the prevailing wisdom that seems to imply that Al-Qaeda is now on the ropes, maybe down and out, and that they've been decimated as an organization. They've been very badly damaged. The death of bin Laden adds to that, but I also think that they are keen to reassert themselves to attack the United States again. And I think one of the lessons over the last 10 years, if there's any lesson, is that they are a very adaptive, survivable organization and one that remains committed to attack the United States.
Are there other organizations you think are similar and would be a threat to us besides?
We are seeing the growth of those. Lashkar-e-Taiba, for one, inside of Pakistan. A number of these groups inside of Pakistan are beginning to take on international objectives that they never did before. I think we have to be very cautious about that.
Thank you. General Keane, what's your take on this?
Yes. Al-Qaeda has been hurt rather significantly, certainly in its leaders and also, frankly, in a lot of its fighters. But they remain a dangerous organization, and we can't keep our eye off the ball here. And one of the things that they still have people that are attracted to it is because of their ideology. And so the organization lives beyond its iconic founder, bin Laden, because people fundamentally believe in the ideology.
Al-Qaeda is really an idea. It's not about a person, isn't it? It's an idea that our way of life is a threat to their beliefs, and therefore, as long as we perpetuate our way of life, which God willing we will, they're going to be this problem. The second thing, General Keane, that you made reference to is your view of the complicity of the Pakistani leadership in maintaining these safe harbors. What would you suggest that we do about that? In other words, what tools do we have to alter the behavior of the Pakistani leadership?
Well, I personally believe we got to take the gloves off with them, because we've been dealing with this relationship, and I call it the soft diplomatic approach, for a number of years, and we've made no dent whatsoever in the capacity of those sanctuaries. And let's put the cards on the table. I mean, out of those sanctuaries, every single day comes a capability that kills and maims our troops, as well as the Afghan security forces. So we got to relook the strategy.
What does take the gloves off mean, though? Does it mean that we ourselves attack the areas? What does it mean?
I think, first of all, admit to ourselves that Kiani and Pasha and other members of their government lied to us routinely, much like the Soviets used to, in trying to manipulate us. And two, clearly, we've got national security objectives in that region. We should be in pursuit of those. Pakistan is part of that. I'm not suggesting it's not. But I think we've got to get a lot tougher with them than what we have been. They are dependent on financial aid, and we have all suggested up here that there should be some kind of conditions associated.
Let me play quick devil's advocate for a minute. It's not my view, but withdrawal of aid or other conditions against the Pakistani government would give way to a more radical and even less friendly Pakistani government that would have access to nuclear weapons. What's your answer to that?
Well, we've been spooked by this issue ever since bin Laden ran into Pakistan. And I was not convinced of it then, and I'm not convinced of it now. The military in Pakistan, we have checked on this, those sites are very secure by that military, and it is the #1 institution in Pakistan.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I want to thank you, General Keane and General Barno and Secretary West, for being here today. It's been a great hearing, and thank you so much for sharing your expertise. And I would like to say to the former chairman of this committee, Duncan Hunter Sr., thank you for being in attendance today. And we are adjourned.